I'm seeing the accusation of virtue signaling going around a lot lately.
Frankly, I've seen the accusations of almost everything going around lately. Racism, sexism, transphobia. Twitter's become one giant cesspool of recrimination. Okay, but this particular video maker looks like he's interested in the accusation of virtue signaling, which is a staple in a lot of the progressive left versus libertarian and alt-right factions on the interwebs. I suppose what remains to be seen is whether this person is a progressive leftist complaining about the accusation of virtue signaling, or a person on the more right or centrist side complaining about the application of virtue signaling. Of course, the easiest way to tell this is how they characterize their opponents. Come on, is it the crazy SJWs who are using virtue signaling, or is it the nutso right-wingers who are complaining about it?
Virtue signaling is the latest in a long line of hastily propagated alt-right neo-reactionary buzzwords.
Called it. At least we know where we stand now. Alright, but now that we've established that people who make accusations of virtue signaling are scary new reactionaries that use buzzwords to try to manipulate us, what does virtue signaling even mean?
The term was originally coined by James Bartholomew for The Spectator to decry people who say, "I don't like this thing very much," in order to feel good about themselves and then just vote Labour every few years or whatever and take no stake in actually making things better.
That makes sense, but it doesn't seem too bad, right? I mean, very few people who work an 8-to-5 job and have kids have even time to do community activism or leadership. Don't get me wrong, people can be smug, but it's a smaller problem, certainly.
This is a fairly straightforwardly good call to action. The term actually decried a real existing problem.
I mean, so far we're on the same page. Virtue signaling might not be the worst thing, but smug people are pretty hard to put up with, so I wonder what's wrong with the term.
Of course, then the idiots got their hands on it. When interpreted poorly, almost every belief, statement, or piece of writing becomes virtue signaling, an attempt to look good for thinking the right thing.
Okay, that's still the same problem you described in the initial segment as legitimate, but I haven't given you a chance. I'm sure there's some qualitative distinction between good virtue signaling and bad virtue signaling that isn't just the kind of person who does it, right?
What's that? You like reading books? You're just trying to look like you do a lot of reading to look smart, you virtue signaler.
Okay. I mean, in addition to sounding incredibly more juvenile, this accusation of virtue signaling is literally nothing I've heard as an adult. I mean, reading? That's like the kind of accusation I'd see in secondary school or something. Has this actually happened to the author of this video?
You tweet pictures of Kamen Rider figurines in silly and compromising poses. You're just trying to signal that you own cool toys and have good photography ability. Gosh, yeah.
That's oddly specific. I'm getting kind of a weird biographical vibe from these examples. Like these are actually instances where the author has been accused of virtue signaling.
You criticize me when I say racist or sexist things or have bizarre fixations with one particular woman. Clearly you just want to make yourself look enlightened and like a vaguely good person so people will think you're nice and, I don't know, sleep with you.
Okay, I think it's safe to say that this actually has happened to the author of this video. And I know it's tongue-in-cheek, it's self-deprecating, but all I've gotten from these examples is that the bad kind of virtue signaling accusation is the kind that's done against the author of this video. What? Middle-class people presenting themselves as upstanding moral citizens when they've just voted for Labour and talked about some liberal talking points and have not yet dedicated their own money and time to causes I support? That's virtue signaling and a very legitimate issue. But whoa, accusations of virtue signaling at me, those are reactionary buzzwords. Alright, perhaps I'm being a little bit facetious. This is an important issue. I think dialogue on the internet and in real life over controversial issues is something we need to talk about. So perhaps here we can take a serious look at the things people are concerned about when they accuse people of virtue signaling, and the reasons that people virtue signal to begin with. Now, I oftentimes wonder whether the whole Catholic guilt thing in my background might be giving me unnecessary hang-ups or impeding me. But on this particular issue, I think Catholic guilt's doing me a favor, because I can think of many times where I've been guilty both of virtue signaling and accusing people of virtue signaling. So I discovered this video as part of a Twitter thread that involved Christy Winters, derived from my previous conversation on social science. And it caught my interest because the subject of virtue signaling had been something that was on my mind, and had been on my mind for quite some time. However, I was a little disappointed to discover that after that initial intro that I played for the opening bit of this video, there really was no more content that was included in this particular YouTube video besides the author just continuously making fun of trolly alt-right people and then laughing at them for the duration of about 10 minutes. So it really occurred to me that more discussion is needed, not just in reaction to this video, but generally, but what people mean by virtue signaling. So I think the first rather important thing to understand about virtue signaling, or the accusation of virtue signaling, is that it's not really a new issue. I don't even think it's a new word. It certainly wasn't an idea that was coined by that Guardian writer. And I think it directly corresponds to older words, roughly standing in for hypocrisy, one of the definitions of hypocrisy, but also more specifically, the rather old-fashioned term called affectation, which is a term that is used to refer to speech or writing that is artificial, feigned, and designed to impress the audience rather than to convey truth. Now, of course, this all seems rather colloquial, it doesn't seem like it's very relevant to our modern days, but viewed in another light, it's quite annoying, and it can be seen as almost betrayal of the trust that goes into a dialogue and a discourse. For example, if two people are engaged in conversation, they could have many objectives, usually to convey some truth, information, perhaps share an emotion between them. However, matters are complicated once there is an audience or the conversation goes on in public, in which case parties involved might feel tempted to say untruths, things they don't believe, false things, fake things, all to curry favor with their audience. Now, of course, I think everyone knows that this is quite annoying. It betrays the honesty of the conversation. It's fake, it's irritating, but still, the whole idea of affectation or hypocrisy in this sense does still seem a little bit colloquial. But in earlier times and under classic virtue, this is actually a very serious issue because it distorts and destroys dialogue as it pertains to making public decisions. If we have a religious or public leader and he says one thing, we want to know that they're speaking honestly and speaking of things that they truly believe in. And a betrayal of that is something that could hurt society and hurt the trust in that society. Of course, we could look to history for examples of this. Affectation and hypocrisy was, of course, one of the principal vices called out by Jesus during his ministry in the Gospels. And going a little bit further into the Enlightenment, we see that hypocrisy and affectation was the chief subject of one of Moliere's most famous plays, Tartuffe. And just to list a personal favorite of mine, one of the thinkers who had the most contempt for this particular sin was Dante Alighieri, who put his flatterers in the eighth circle of hell, buried upside down in a giant river of excrement. Now, once again, we see images like this, and it looks very extreme. But keep in mind, in the ancient world, they understood that if it were possible for leaders to be insincere and dishonest and get away with it, it would undermine the fundamental trust that people had in their societies and lead to social unrest. Alright, but let's get to the big question. Is virtue signaling and affectation a problem in our current conversations? Because I think we're all aware of the type of virtue signaling and affectations that, while annoying, are more or less innocent. These happen sometimes at religious gatherings, and they happen all the time at political gatherings. And more or less, they just elicit a cringe, kind of feeling of dishonesty, but they're passed over more or less innocently. I don't engage in political events too much, but I've been at a few pro-life gatherings, and there's an incredible temptation to always one-up everyone else there. Someone wants to repeal Roe v. Wade, you'll say something like, well, I, for one, think it should be illegal in all 50 states.
And I, for one, welcome our new insect overlords. I'd like to remind them that as a trusted TV personality, I can be helpful in rounding up others to toil in their underground sugar cave.
But I think coming into the 21st century, we are at a point where our dialogue and discourse have been degraded with dishonesty and suspicion to a point where we really should be concerned about the kinds of discourse we engage in. We live in an era where the personal really has become political. And in that kind of environment, an affectation can be very, very damaging and dishonest. Now, we live in a very weird environment in the modern world where no one is really so certain how online conversations should be perceived. Are they important public dialogue, or are they just personal back and forths? And this contributes to the general confusion about whether some faux pas committed in this environment is a really serious problem or not. But I consider conversations online to be important. And if this is the case, then this affectation that's projected can be quite damaging. Now, I understand the video that was originally the subject matter for this reaction. He comes back to just this point later on, when he begins discussing why accusing people of virtue signaling is damaging to a dialogue overall.
Let's give the 3 main reasons why. Firstly, let's say the person you're arguing with really does think they're making themselves look more virtuous for calling you out for saying something that sounds very racist. That doesn't invalidate their point, does it?
And here I think you have the main problem. What the author is saying is technically true, but even in the example he gives, it's where he chooses to start the dissection of the actual validity of the statements that is where the real fallacy lies. In his example, the accusation of virtue signaling comes after an accusation of racism, something that's equally abusive inside a conversation. And frankly, accusations of racism and misogyny are way more common tactics to actually shut down rational discourse. Think how many times this happens on the internet.
This argument is about as stupid as your garden variety ad hominem argument. Oh, you criticised my behaviour? Well, you're dumb and you smell and you just want to look good, because it doesn't even need to be an inaccurate statement to be clearly bullshit.
But here's the problem. The accusations of racism and sexism that are frequently the subject of the accusation of virtue signaling are also garden variety ad hominems. They're even more garden variety. I see them all the time.
It is an actual historical fact that Socrates smelt like shit and didn't take care of his kids either. He might have secretly thought he was super smart and liked looking smart by criticising people, but that doesn't make him any less biting or correct when he tears apart someone's belief system in a story. You can be right and take regular showers, but in a discussion, the ideas should be the focus, not the perceived self-righteousness, extant or otherwise, of the people you disagree with.
Now, all of this is absolutely correct, but there's a corollary that I'm wondering if the author would agree with. Just like you can be self-righteous or unclean and still be right, someone can also be racist or sexist and still be right as well. And not only that, the accusation of racism, sexism, and homophobia have in the past been used to shut down totally legitimate thinkers from expressing concern with problems that they notice in society. I'm just thinking back to the 80s when people were pointing out unsafe practices like bathhouses, and when they were asked to close them, they were accused of homophobia. We can even look at the Moynihan Report, which pointed out the problem of fatherlessness in the black family, whose authors were accused of being racist. But let's keep going.
It seems reductive to believe you know a person's intent or secret deep inner feelings, because I don't even know my inner feelings on a lot of topics. I have to stay away from male Greek statues because they awaken things in me. So to pretend that I could deign to know your inner feelings is stupid. I like to take people at their word.
Again, this is absolutely correct, but I'm wondering how seriously I should take this when this is coming from an author of a video who's been implying throughout that his opponents are secretly racist and sexist. But there's still one last point that the author has against accusations of virtue signaling.
Thirdly, once you invoke it, you grant that it's wrong to criticize things just to make yourself look good. But isn't that inherently what you're doing when you accuse someone else of doing it? You're saying, quite straightforwardly, I am smarter and better than you because I don't virtue signal.
Alright, this is a legitimate point, and the author is indeed right. An accusation of virtue signaling, apropos of nothing, is an abusive conversational tactic. But at this point, I don't think we can get around the central observation that I do not believe the emergence of accusations of virtue signaling come out of nowhere. They come as a specific reaction to a culture of argumentation that seeks to impugn the character and personality of the person arguing with accusations of racism and sexism and homophobia, rather than sticking to the actual points of the argument. And in these situations, the accusation of virtue signaling is purely defensive. This is a problem in online conversation because it's so unclear whether the conversation going on is something in public or something that is personal. And therefore, people are constantly trying to signal and wondering what they should be saying. This is the main reason why I don't debate people on Facebook and in other public forums. And it's funny because if you talk to people in a chat or face-to-face, a lot of the positions they held in Facebook or on some YouTube forum will immediately melt away and they'll be more honest. And I do this too. It's always very tempting to want to be a badass, never give an inch when you're talking on some forum when you feel like you're being watched. You're talking face-to-face, there's a much greater ability to consider issues rationally. But I think we can't get away from the fact that accusations of racism, purely done for affectation, are a problem. I remember back to 2014 and the death of Michael Brown, and more than 3 different people jumped on me as being problematic because I described the situation as being tragic. There's nothing necessarily racist about that, but apparently everyone decided that calling the situation a tragedy was something that implied secret racism. And this is what people talk about when they talk about virtue signaling. And the author of the video, I think, gets into a little bit of this in his last bit before the close.
People who use this term often simply don't have any worthwhile criticisms to make of the arguments that face them, or are unable to express it meaningfully, so they pick a word from the list and throw it out there. Accusing someone of virtue signaling isn't simply lazy and often inaccurate, it actively flies in the face of the very concept of words having meaning. You can see the same thing taking place on the opposite side as well. The phrase problematic has become something of a joke itself because of its overuse.
And here I think we have found the precious common ground. If we can understand accusations of virtue signaling as a response to accusations done in a spirit of affectation, I think people can work together to make discourse better. Hey, perhaps this is an opportunity for a dialogue. We could talk together about the mutual problem of baseless accusations and then also the snide reaction to them.
But these people tend to then turn around and explain why these things are, as it were, problematic. These people can be right or wrong in their assessments, of course, but at least they don't just yell, virtue signal, lol, and then run away.
Okay. You just couldn't end the video without that one last dagger in the side. Fair enough. Look, if I could address the author, H. Bomberman, I've gone through this video and explained exactly what people mean by virtue signaling. And I hope maybe we could meet in dialogue to have you explain what you find problematic, perhaps what you don't like about terms like cultural Marxism, your other issues with the anti-feminists on YouTube. I am very, very willing to have that dialogue. I promise I won't run away. And I hope that you won't run away either. At any rate, I'm looking to hear from you, and maybe we can have a conversation. Thanks for watching, and have a great night.